Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of my series Inside the Expert's Mind. And today I'm privileged and delighted to have with me Professor Brian Donley, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Cleveland Clinic London, and dare I say it, my boss, so I have to be a little bit careful about what we ask him. And can I have my next slide, please? So it's been my privilege for the last 3 years, having been appointed by Brian after a clandestine breakfast in Warren Street, to work for Cleveland Clinic London, and it's an organisation. It's a great organisation with amazing values and priorities. And here's a slide which encompasses many of the values of Cleveland Clinic London. And if I could draw your attention to the values themselves, which are quality and safety, teamwork, empathy, inclusion, integrity, and innovation. And my favorite on this slide, which is the guiding principles, which is that we should treat patients and our colleagues as if they were family, and the organization as if it was our home. So it's been my pleasure to work here at Cleveland Clinic London, and it makes me feel younger every day. So if we could take the slides off now, please. Thank you, Maria. So Brian, if I can ask you, just tell us about your early life, your upbringing, and what it was that took you into medicine, please.
Hey, Richard, first of all, thanks for having me here and having the opportunity to talk with you. You know, when you said inside the expert's mind, I assume that's you. You're the expert. So thanks for having me here. You know, I think that's an interesting question for all of us to ask ourselves. And whether you're in medicine or not in medicine, but what were the steps that took you to where you are? When I reflect back on my years growing up, and I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is about halfway between New York and Chicago. I had 2 older brothers and older sister. My mother was a school nurse, and my father was a pharmacist. And I think when I grew up and I look back at the influences on me, I remember in the neighborhood that we grew up in, people would always come to our house and want to ask questions to my dad about medications with his pharmacy background, or my mom as a nurse. I remember oftentimes people coming and sitting on the steps in our house, scraped their knee, fell, had some dizziness. And I always remember being so proud, being a young kid, to see my mom and dad helping the other people in the neighborhood. And so as I've reflected back and think, you know, why did I go into medicine and what were the steps down there? I think those early years of seeing my mom and dad caring for others and seeing how the community viewed our house, made me so proud and made me think that's something I want to do and serve others. And I think that was probably the foundation of really pursuing this type of career.
And obviously it's difficult to get into medical school, and we perceive it in the UK as being even more difficult in the United States. Plus, there's the enormous cost. So, did you have trouble getting in, or were you that fabulously bright young student that got whatever they wanted? And how did you manage to sort of survive the rigors of paying your way through medical school? And tell us about when you met and when you married your lovely wife, Mary, rather.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rich. I mean, I did pretty well in science. And did pretty well in school. For us, you go through secondary school. For us, is high school. You apply to college. I went to Notre Dame, which is located in Indiana, and that actually was a big fork in the road. I think all of us have forks in the road, and you don't always see that fork at the time you're at it, but you can reflect back on it. Going to Notre Dame was a big fork in the road for me, and 2 things happened there. On the very first day I went, I was assigned to a random roommate, and by luck and incredible fortune for me, it ended up being a gentleman named John Muir, who ended up being my roommate for all 4 years at college and 3 years of medical school. He now is the chief of plastic surgery at Boston Children's, and does other tremendous things with a group called Partners in Health and a lot with global health. And so to have the opportunity to be around John, see his work ethic, see his empathy, was, I think, a significant influence on me. the other important day to your question was my third day at Notre Dame, and that's actually when I met Mary and my wife. And I've been extremely fortunate to be able to spend, the last 32 years, and essentially since the third day at Notre Dame, with someone who has values like I've never seen before, and especially around integrity, around empathy, around work ethic, around humility. And so, I think those influences, and when we combine your earlier question about my parents, led me down that pathway. And as you said, Richard, I think we all have tough times as you go through this pathway into medicine. And it's nice to have a support structure that can help you through those times. And those people were my support structure to help me through that.
And so how did you get into orthopedics? I always get asked why I'm a colorectal surgeon, and my stock answer is to say, where there's muck, there's brass, which makes everyone tittle a bit. But so what made you get into orthopedics?
When I was in medical school, I went to University of Michigan for medical school. And in our third year of medical school is when we do the different rotations. I actually loved every rotation. I go on a cardiology rotation. It's so fascinating to learn how the heart works, to see the different, the EKG, to see cardiac catheterizations. I do a neurology fellowship. I love neuroanatomy, to learn about the amygdala, limbic system, spinothalamic tract. I just loved all that. But then when I did orthopedics, I equally loved orthopedics. But for me, I think it was the people that were around orthopedics, and they just seemed more similar to who I was. And I thought that's something I could do for a career. So I really was influenced by some mentors within orthopedics that really probably made me comfortable to choose that as my career, which, as you know, Richard, is interesting because now actually my career is not focused fully on orthopedics, but more on hospital leadership.
Sure, and indeed we'll come on to that shortly. So just a bit further. So what made you either descend or rise to being a foot, that part of the body? What was it about the foot that interested you so much to specialize in it?
I was really interested in the anatomy. And so, the foot and ankle, I'm always proud to say, has, with the hand, has the most significant number of bones in the entire body. It's very different. There's a tremendous number of disorders of the foot and a tremendous number of different surgeries, different approaches, and an intricate anatomy. And so that's really was interesting to me. And then, within orthopedics, there's some level of people who are interested in sports. So within my orthopedic foot and ankle career, I kind of went down to sports foot and ankle interest, and then an interest in adult reconstruction with a foot and ankle replacement and things like that was really what I ended up focusing my specific surgical career on.
So moving on to the other half, or now whole, of your career. So tell us how you got to come to the Cleveland Clinic, and when your zest for leadership started. Was it before or after you arrived at the Cleveland Clinic?
Yeah, I would say it's after I arrived at the Cleveland Clinic. And the Cleveland Clinic is a doctor-led model of care, and the Cleveland Clinic is a nonprofit organization, which means there's no shareholders. Any surplus at the end of the year gets reinvested back into the organization for research, education, and around technology. Since the Cleveland Clinic is a doctor-led organization, we put a lot of time and effort into developing physician leadership. I probably, halfway through my career, started down that pathway of physician leadership. And I always say, I think I was about 3 years down that pathway before I even knew I was down that pathway. But the big fork in the road at this point then was when I was asked to run a committee that took care of disruptive physicians. And we have a group around 4,000 doctors at the Cleveland Clinic. And so that process, as I went into it, I really didn't realize what that was about, but it allowed me to learn a lot about the impact that physician behavior can have on quality and safety and on other caregivers. And so the other important part of that was it allowed me, because it's across the entire organization, allowed me to develop a significant number of relationships across the Cleveland Clinic organization. So early in my career, I was able to meet the leadership of all the different institutes. And I think that was important too. Richard, maybe specifically to your question of what started making me more interested in altering my career more towards leadership. I started realizing, as much as I love the fulfillment of operating on a patient, having them come back, give you a hug, give you appreciation for taking a condition that prevented them from walking, doing an ankle replacement, and then saying, thank you, I can walk now being pain-free. I still remember my patient coming in and saying, because of you and the ankle replacement that you developed and put in me, I was able to dance at my granddaughter's wedding. And I remember that satisfaction. But I realized then with the professional conduct committee, I was able to get that same satisfaction as you were able to help people be better themselves for doctors and change that behavior. But also, when that behavior was changed, the impact it had on other caregivers was really gratifying to see how people's lives were improved. And so it's actually very closely tied together. Some people think it's two completely different fields. It's actually the exact same, but you can scale it at a much bigger level. And that's what's happened through my levels of different leadership across the organization.
So I used to think when I was younger that, in those days that one could do anything. And if one wanted to be a super footballer, you just had to practice a lot. And if you want to be or a tennis player or whatever, but I've come to realize that, Premier League footballers are born talented, picked up by talent scouts and developed. So my sort of killer question for you, if I'm allowed, is do you believe that leaders are born to be leaders, or is it possible to take anyone and train them to be a leader?
Richard, you will not be surprised that my answer would be in the middle of that. And so I think, and how I always think about development and people I mentor, is I think of three circles. One circle is, what are your skill sets and what are you good at? The other circle is, what does the organization or society value? And so what's the overlap of your skill set and what's the overlap of either the organization, society, or what entity you're working with? And where do those, where can you use your skill sets? So to your analogy, I'm not good at basketball. So I'm never going to be a professional basketball player. My skill set never goes into that circle. The third circle, though, is the most important, and that's your passion. And so I think it's critical that that third circle, so where the three of them overlap, is the sweet spot. And so to your question, are leaders born or are they created? I think you have to have some skill set, but I know for sure, similar to studying colorectal surgery, you can study leadership and you can grow and be a better leader. It's a question of where your passion is. So I always say, especially with physician leadership, as much as you study colorectal surgery, I study orthopedics, you have to study leadership. And in order to do that, you have to have a passion around it if you're going to be a good leader.
How do you spot the leaders of the future? I mean, do you send, like in soccer, they send talent scouts to schools all over the place to find that kid that can put the ball in or bounce the ball 100 times on his or her knee? How do you spot leaders for the future in Cleveland Clinic?
I think two things I think of when you ask that question, Richard. One is, I don't think of strengths and weaknesses in individuals. I think of attributes. And so it's not whether someone is great at this or terrible at this. It's how do we put their attributes in the best possible position for them to be successful. And ultimately, as you do that, then the overall team and the organization is successful. And I think that's a really important thing to think about as all of you are at different phases of your leadership, is everyone comes with a skill set, and how do we put them in the best position to be the best version of themselves. Your second question is around growing leadership and how you do that. I will tell you, at the Cleveland Clinic, what we do is we do a lot of experiential learning. And so a bulk of leadership training is around starting with different experiences. And it's important to see whether the doctor likes that, and also if they're good at that. And then you can move them up to another position, increase the responsibility, increase the experience, and kind of do it in a stepwise fashion. If you have time, Richard, my personal story is, I went from that professional conduct committee to take care of disruptive physicians. I then was asked to be the president of one of our hospitals. It was about a 200-bed hospital with 1,000 employees. And we had some good experiences there and had a lot of good learning. I then went to Harvard Business School, because it's not just all experiential training. There is some classroom part of it that can be helpful. Then came back and ran all of our regional hospitals and operations, which was about 2,500 people, and then went on to be chief of staff and chief of clinical operations. At that time, that was running the 4,000 physician group and about 45,000 people. And so it's a stepwise fashion, I think, as you develop leadership.
So this might be a slightly difficult question, but how do you measure the success of a senior leader? I mean, you are a great leader, Brian, and I don't need to say any more. But how would you measure the success of a leader coming through? It's not just about income generation and those factors. What would be your most important factors?
Yeah, it's absolutely not about income generation. I think there's metrics that you can put in place, and so define what goals and objectives you want to achieve and put metrics around that. But I will tell you, I think one of the most important metrics and what we drive at the Cleveland Clinic and what I've driven in my different steps of leadership are two basic principles. And it's what was taught about 2,400 years ago by Aristotle. And there's only two things that every person wants. And they want meaning and purpose in the work they do. And they want opportunities to learn and grow to be the best version of themselves. And so I think the success of a leader is how can you better drive meaning and purpose into the work of every individual, and how do you allow them to be the best version of themselves? What that ends up doing when you accomplish that is then you actually get people at their best. You end up then with a much better success with your team. And so the hard metrics that people define as hard metrics are a lot easier to achieve when you work on the principles of what I'd say is Aristotle and allow people to be their best.
Well, I never knew it went back to Aristotle. No, yes, I can see that. So in effect, what you're saying is that it's what comes after you that defines how successful you were yourself, I suppose. I don't want to take too much of your time, and I'm very grateful for that which you've given us, Brian. But tell us, what advice have you got for an aspiring leader, someone who there's a flicker of interest in leadership? How would you advise someone like that?
One thing maybe we haven't talked about, Richard, which I think is an important component of this answer, is having your value system rock solid, having it defined, and realizing that you will not veer from it. And so, as you showed in that first slide, there's a reason why at the very bottom of that slide are the values, because that's the foundation of the organization. It also, in a similar way, every one of us needs to think about what our values are and what our foundation is. And maybe going back to your previous question about defining success, I think the important part of success is the character and integrity of the people that are on your team. And so I think a big part of leadership and defining if you want to be a leader is looking hard and having some self-reflection around what your values are. And not everyone has to be a leader. There's many ways to contribute to society, all of them very, very important, because remember, we're all in one shared humanity. And so there's lots of different ways, and having the self-reflection to know whether that fits my value system and it fits my passion is, I think, the opportunity to determine whether leadership is something you're interested in, and is that the way you want to spend your life?
And my last question to you, Brian, just say you were allowed to come back in 100 years' time and look at the building behind you, the Cleveland Clinic London. What would make you really happy to see in terms of how the Cleveland Clinic in London had developed?
I think that what will make me happy in 100 years is if in London and across more than London, people come to Cleveland Clinic London because they feel that whether it's to come here for care or to come here to work, that it is a place where empathy is expressed from one person to another better than anywhere in the world. And that's probably what would make me most proud in a professional way.
Well, I genuinely hope as well that that's what we will both see in 100 years' time. Brian, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Inside the Expert's Mind. I'm really grateful to you, and I look forward to working with you to open Cleveland Clinic London, and I'm sure it will be as successful as we both help. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you for having me, and thank you actually for all that you do and all you bring to Cleveland Clinic London.